I'm Roger Wakimoto, and I am the president of the American Meteorological Society, and I want to welcome you all to this event. This is the third annual Dr. James Mahoney Memorial Lecture, and I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. I'm only a few minutes because I know there are other speakers that are come up, but I want to tell you a little bit about Jim and his very close relationship with the American Meteorological Society. Jim was president in 1990. Give you just a flavor, he actually created a strategic plan that, or certainly oversaw it, that helped set the course for the modernizing the society. So it was a big deal when he did that. He was on the Planning Commission. He was on the Investment Committee. He was part of the review of the American Meteorological Society a number of years ago. So he was very, very connected with everything that the society did. The AMS partners with Noaa to create this lecture. And you have to realize that it's to highlight the role of science in the policy process and to provide opportunities to hear leading scientists who have played a critical role in that process. And certainly today's speaker is no exception. I don't know, is Craig Mclean here? I wanted to give a shout out to Craig. I guess he was not able to be here, but I will still call out his name because without Craig, it would have been very difficult to have this lecture because it was he that helped us with Noaa support it. Tomorrow is the AMS Washington Forum. And that forum, which is 3 full days as I recall, is going to bring leaders from the government, private, and academic sectors in the weather, water, and climate communities together. And what we do is we discuss a lot of issues relevant to the community and to interact with policymakers, with agencies, and people in the Hill. So I hope you agree that these two events, the forum that starts tomorrow and today, the memorial lecture, they're both very connected. It's almost seamless and natural that we tag these two things together, and that's why we've done this. So that's all I want to say. I'm looking forward to hearing Jane talk, but I have the honor of passing the baton over to Neil Jacobs. He is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction. So Neil.
Thank you, Roger. On behalf of Noaa, welcome to the annual Dr. James Mahoney Memorial Lecture. I know we're going to be in for a fantastic seminar from Dr. Luchenko, and it's a true honor for me to be up here with such accomplished and distinguished guests. And a special welcome to Jim's family, who's also in attendance. Over the years, I've studied Dr. Mahoney's policy positions, not just through his testimony, but also through the writings of Bill Hook. So thank you for that, Bill. Dr. Mahoney was a very successful entrepreneur and was a trailblazer in bridging the gap between public, private, and academic sectors. In light of this aspect of his career, I'd like to highlight a few goals of the current Noaa leadership. The first is focus on big data management, including commercial data acquisition through public-private partnerships, exploring alternative business models with industry to solve what I'm beginning to refer to as the finite resource of HPC, and strengthen collaboration with other agencies in academia through private sector to develop the next generation global prediction system as a true community model. Ironically, we are still struggling to surpass the theoretical limits of predictability outlined by Edward Lorenz in 1963 at MIT, where Dr. Mahoney was a PhD student at the time. And lastly, Noaa's scientific integrity policy. So the tenets of science are unchanged. Defendable, the scientific method. We're going to be putting together some modules to show various scientific methods, including hypothesis testing instead of hypothesis proving, transparency, and peer review. So now that we're in a digital age, one of the things that we're going to be pushing for is to publish anonymous reviewer comments and the back and forth with the authors, anonymized, of course, but There's no reason not to do this in the supplemental material because it's all digitized now. And then reproducibility. So this is part of NOAA's open data policy. Once we have all this data out there for everyone to download and use, reproducing the results should be fairly simple. So those are just a few of the things that we'll be working on, but it's my distinct pleasure at this time to introduce my good friend Vice Admiral Conrad Laudenbacher. He's currently the CEO of commercial GPS RO company, GeoOptics, and he previously served as the Undersecretary of Oceans and Atmospheres and the NOAA Administrator from 2001 to 2008. Dr. Laudenbacher.
Neil, thank you very much. See, I don't need to talk into the microphones. Everybody hear me okay? I can. Fabulous. It's indeed a great privilege, pleasure, and an honor to be here, and I definitely appreciate all of you coming to join us in this annual event, which was started 3 years ago. I want to thank Roger and AMS for their sponsorship and their help in making this work and being here and being a leading light. So Roger, thank you very much. I want to thank Neil Jacobs representing NOAA today as the other co-sponsor of this lecture. And I think it's time well spent and memories worthwhile continuing to think about and to internalize for ourselves. I also want to thank Jane for coming today. Without Jane, we wouldn't have this nice pitch she's going to give for you. I also want to recognize the family who is sitting here. From Jim's family is here, and that's a real privilege and a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you. I just want to tell a couple of stories about Jim and then move on. When I was finally convinced that I should agree to be the head of NOAA, I went back to Sam Bodman, who was the Deputy Secretary of Commerce at the time, who twisted my arm to a certain extent anyway. And I said, okay, my wife has finally agreed that I can do this. So. And he said, well, who are you thinking about as a deputy? And I said, well, I haven't gotten that far yet. He says, well, I have a perfect candidate for you. Jim Mahoney, good friend of mine and colleague, and I remember Sam was a professor of chemical engineering at MIT, so he had a pretty good handle on what was going on in Massachusetts and all the things that Jim used to do. And so I was impressed when he told me everything about Jim, and I said, I think that's great. And of course I talked to Jim and I was even more impressed, and so he became my deputy, and I really admired him and did better, much better, I think, because I had his advice and his support in the kinds of things we did. One of the things that he really took over for us in NOAA was the climate change science program. Can I say that word in Washington today, climate change, or is that bad? And so there was a lot of effort going on in the beginning of the administration that I served in as well, and I found myself spending hour after hour at these ridiculous meetings, which you know how I all love. People who know me know I don't love meetings a whole lot. And so I said to Jim, I really need help with this. And he agreed to take it on. And of course, it wasn't very popular with some people. It was a bone of contention. There were lots of cabinet meetings that went on. There were lots of discussions and different views being expressed and ways, and it just went on. And I said, I really need some help, because NOAA is not just climate change. There's a lot of other things that NOAA does that's important. And so Jim did that, and he did a fantastic job. And he had the perfect personality, because first of all, he's very sociable. He knows how to approach people. He talks very well. He speaks well. He knows how to change your mind. And that's really good. What I liked about Jim was I could go to Jim and have a completely different opinion on a subject and ask Jim about it. And Jim would start agreeing with me very nicely. And then he would just gradually twist the scenario a little bit until at the end, I was at the other side of the issue. And I'm sure he did that in many of his previous engagements. He was a great professor, a professor at Harvard for a few years. He started a business, which is today, it's a pioneering effort of the businesses that many of us are in today that support science and support the agencies of the United States government. In any case, I could go through a long list of Jim's, but he was a favorite of mine, and I really enjoyed working with him. So let me switch to our speaker, because we want to have time to give her speech and not listen to me all day. But we have a lot in common. Okay, first of all, we are both the head of Noaa for a while, and so we have experienced what that really means. And there are some very good things and some very challenging aspects about being the head of Noaa. We both got our PhDs from Harvard, which is, of course, we were different topics, but I found that very interesting as well. And the other thing that I have to tell you, besides the fact that she's an incredibly well-written, well-known, well-publicized academic figure, she's the I have to get the title right because I have it here somewhere, right now. She's the University Distinguished Professor at Oregon State University. And I think most of us know that she has spent much of her time at Oregon and raising PhDs and BAs and writing MAs and writing extensively. She's recognized around the world as an expert in many fields. She's prolific. She has 20 honorary degrees, PhDs from universities, which is extraordinary. And she still keeps working hard and doing all these kinds of things to help the community. She was President Barack Obama's science team when that began, and she was the first U.S. State Department science envoy for the ocean. I had such a long list here. I don't want to read it all, but she is a very distinguished. The other thing I have to say, besides the background, I really appreciate her continuation of many of the good things that Noaa started while I was there, and Jim Baker, and are still continuing. I particularly appreciate the efforts we worked together to get the ocean into Washington. There was no ocean in Washington except the aquarium at the Commerce Building. So there is now an ocean hall in the Smithsonian. And we pushed the system together before either of us, well, me during there at that time, before Jane became the head of it, to convince some people to help out with it, one being Roger Sant, who created a wonderful kind of legacy for himself and his family in creating the Ocean Hall. For those of you that haven't seen the Ocean Hall in the Smithsonian, it is the ocean in Washington, and I hope you all do that. In any case, let me stop talking and ask Jane to come up and give her lecture, and thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Connie, thank you very much for that nice introduction. Roger and Neil, it's a pleasure to be here with both of you today. Barbara, thank you for everything that you have done to help create this mechanism for us to come together and to honor a really wonderful person. It's a treat for me to have met some of the family of Jim Mahoney, and to have them with us here today, I think speaks for how close-knit that family is, how proud they are of the legacy that Jim Mahoney represents. But it's wonderful for us to stay connected with that family because we all think so very highly of Jim Mahoney. We are here to honor the man, but also his legacy, and to reflect on how what he did is actually very relevant today, and how what he how he did things and how he conceptualized the world really presents some role models for all of us. The topic of my remarks today is science in a post-truth world. And I see this through the lens of a scientist, but reflecting on what's happening in society today. And I chose this topic in part because I think it is not only topical, it must be on the minds of most of you in this room, and it provides an opportunity for us to collectively reflect on what our obligations as scientists are, how science is related to society, dependent on society, helping to benefit society. And those were topics that I think were near and dear to Jim's heart. That's really what he spent a lot of his life doing, is thinking about society, science and society. Before I launch into my specific remarks, I just want to take stock of who all is here. I know many of you, and in fact, it's great to see some old friends, folks I haven't seen for a while, such a treat. But how many of you here are from Noaa? Just a show of hands. Okay, quite a few folks. Thank you guys for coming. I know your lives are really, really busy. How many AMS folks do we have here? Okay, terrific. And how many academics are in the audience? Okay. How many government folks, Noaa or otherwise? Government folks? Okay, great. Industry, business and industry? Excellent, terrific. Okay. So this partnership between AMS and Noaa in creating this lectureship is really the kind of partnership that we need. We need more of these connectors between different segments of society coming together to make good things happen. And I appreciate Neil's talking about that, shining a spotlight on it, and I think that in fact, is very, very important. Turning to the topic of science in a post-truth world, I really chose this in part because the rich legacy that Jim left as a scientist, as an academic, as a business entrepreneur, a government leader, and a role model was a real nice integration of things that are important to connect science to society. And as most of you know, he, in addition to having multiple distinguished careers, really navigated two emerging issues that were rife with tension, rife with political tension, and produced outcomes that were both true to the science and politically feasible. That's not an easy thing to do. And he, in both of those arenas, showed that it is possible and showed possible ways for achieving that endpoint. How to get good science into policy, how to organize interdisciplinary efforts, how to have interagency collaboration and cooperation. And his connecting science to policy, but also these interdisciplinary approaches, while always respecting scientific integrity, I think are hallmarks of his legacy that are super relevant today. In my remarks, I'm going to try to leave you with the following three thoughts. One is that there are unprecedented threats to science today, but that we also have unparalleled opportunities. And how we deal with those threats and whether we take advantage of those opportunities is a function of what scientists do. Those of you in this room, scientists in academia, scientists in industry, scientists in government agencies, scientists in NGOs as well. Those scientists have an amazing opportunity, but they also have, I think, more responsibility and more opportunity than many of them realize. I'm going to talk a little bit to frame the issue in terms of what I see as a science and society paradox, focus on how people have already responded to that paradox, and then end with what I see as opportunities for where we can go from here. Here's the paradox. At the very time that science is so important to people's lives, it is relevant, it is helpful, it is making things possible that never were, we see a widening gap between science and society. Now, you will note that the date of this cartoon that was in the Boston Globe was 2012. The cartoon wasn't animated, I animated it, but this is not a new topic. This has been a topic that has been underway for some time. Many people have thought about, okay, what does this disconnect mean? How do we address it? And in fact, when I was the president of AAAS, the topic of my presidential address in 1998 for the society was entering the century of the environment, the need for a new social contract with science. And what I said at the time was simply that so much of the knowledge that scientists have is locked away in journals, is shared in professional scientific meetings, but is not necessarily getting to the public, to policymakers, to leaders in industry, to civil society more broadly. And that we no longer had the luxury of time to expect that stuff in the peer-reviewed literature would eventually work its way into public consciousness. And that it was actually the responsibility of scientists to share what they knew in a more active way with the people that were making that science possible, with society more broadly. And that we needed to be a lot more active in communicating science in ways that were relevant, understandable, credible, and useful to society. And that was sort of a rethinking of our social contract. It was not enough to simply discover new knowledge, to advance the frontiers of science. We had to go beyond that. We couldn't just discover and publish. We had to share as well. And that sharing needed to be done in ways that demonstrated true humility and transparency. It wasn't just, here's what you want to know, take my word for it, and I'm up here on this pedestal and I'm going to tell you the truth. It needed to be more humble, more honest, more transparent in terms of what we know, what we don't know. That, I would suggest, was not the beginning of a conversation. Other people had been talking about it, but it really crystallized in a lot of people's minds some of the opportunities for science. And I think in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, we saw an innovation within the scientific community more broadly, not just here in the United States, but abroad, that was really, from an academic standpoint, sort of getting out of the ivory tower and realizing that there are opportunities for us to connect with the world. Government agencies had been doing this for some time, and I'll talk about them in a minute, but this initial thinking of mine was very much focused on the academic world. So I would characterize this from ivory tower to a social contract, from just doing science to also sharing it more broadly. And so the focus at that time was on science communication. It was on getting information out. Following that, we've seen the emergence of a number of new organizations that are designed to help scientists learn how to do what I call be bilingual, be able to speak the language of science, but also speak the language of lay people. And the Leopold Leadership Program that I co-founded, Compass that I co-founded, and Climate Central that I co-founded are all variations on this theme of helping scientists who really want to and have potential to be great communicators figure out how to do it, how to be more effective and have the networks and the support to actually do it. The AAAS now has a fantastic program, the Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology, the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science takes a really interesting approach using improv to do some of the same things. So now we see a variety of opportunities that exist. And I would suggest that these are fantastic, but they're not enough. And one of the things that I saw at Noaa and was told by many of the scientists at Noaa is that we don't have all the opportunities we want to have the kind of training that we think we need to be more effective. And so there is an opportunity. So those programs, I think, have been underway. I think we've seen a real transformation in the appetite of scientists for being more public. At the same time, I think that many people were really stunned, caught off guard, and very surprised with the emergence of a populist global movement that has risen much more quickly than I think people thought was happening and took everybody by surprise. And in fact, in 2016, the Oxford English Dictionary identified post-truth as the word of the year for 2016. And the suggestion is that, for many of us, for decades and decades, science was seen as really essential to our future. It was a trusted source of knowledge. It was a key to conquering diseases or winning the space race, an engine of economic growth. And this belief in the importance of science has recently been swamped by this emergence of this post-truth world. You will note that OED defined post-truth, and I just want to read the definition. Relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Just a few days ago, Ted Koppel, in speaking at Stanford, said, in his view, fake news, alternative facts, post-truth politics are, quote, corrosive to the very foundations of a vibrant democracy. And so this is seen by a number of people as a challenge to things that we have held near and dear, the importance of evidence, the importance of information, and presents a real challenge to society more broadly and to science more specifically. The emergence of this post-truth world galvanized scientists like I have never seen before. We saw immediate responses that were to demonstrate, to march, to defend science. And there were marches last year and this year, science marches. These are some of the signs, symbols that of incredible variety and creativity. And this focus on science was not just scientists marching, but a lot of citizens marching as well. And I think that that's really an important note. It's also important to note that this was a global phenomenon. This is not just a US phenomenon. There were all these locations around the world for last year's science marches. So this really is a global phenomenon. Even Antarctica, there were marches and signs that were present. So the responses by scientists, researchers, and educators was to demonstrate and to defend science. But it was more than that. I have personally seen a lot of scientists that never did anything other than stay in their little lanes, contact their members of Congress for the first time, donating to organizations that were standing up for science, writing op-eds or letters to the editor, returning calls from journalists, imagine, talking to or embracing social media. So there's been a lot of this. And in fact, I gave a talk last year at the annual meeting of the National Academy of Sciences So these are some of the highly recognized scientists in the country, many of them quite distinguished scientists. And I asked them how many of them had done one or more of these things in the last year. So this was last spring. And probably 2/3 of the hands in the room went up, which just astounded me. And I said, how many of you did one of these things 5 years ago? Most of the hands went down. It was just a smattering. So the point here is that scientists have been really galvanized to stand up for science. I believe, though, that this is just part of the answer. This is defending and resisting. And I think we need offense, not just defense. Not that defense is unimportant, but that it's only part of the strategy. And everybody knows in any kind of sports that you really need both. I reflected on some of these challenges, and a little more than a year ago wrote an editorial in the Frontiers in Ecology and Environment journal. And then later, just about a year ago now, gave a talk when I received the Public Welfare Medal from the National Academy of Sciences, focusing on this theme of science in a post-truth world. And what I would like to do is share with you some of the things that I was suggesting then, and I'm going to update with current sort of how my thinking on this has evolved. So the question is, how can we resolve this science-society paradox and address a post-truth mentality? First and foremost, I think we need to listen. That's one of the most important lessons in communication. You need to understand. You don't just start doing stuff. Defense is a reaction, but to have a very savvy, smart, effective offense, you need to understand what the landscape is, what the issues are, what the players are. So first and foremost, scientists need to understand, and then address the reasons why this post-truth world has emerged. Those are complex. They're very complex, and I don't pretend to have the expertise to fully understand all of what's out there. But I'd like to share sort of two categories, what I think are contributing factors on the societal side, and then in a minute I'll talk about contributing factors on the science side. There's been a lot written and said about how important the increased inequities are in this country and around the world in laying the groundwork for a post-truth society. Economic as well as opportunity inequities. Those are very real. There are also very powerful vested interests that are promulgating a very self-serving set of messages, an anti-science agenda, and we can't deny that those are there and ignore that they exist. We also, though, have other things happening in society. People can now choose where they get their news. When I was growing up, everybody got their news from the newspapers, or if you had a newspaper that wasn't actually all that good, which was the case in Denver, we got our news from the TV. Every night on the evening news, and there were 3 channels, and they all pretty much had the same news. So you chose whether you're going to watch A, B, or C, depending on which personalities you like. But it was pretty much the same kind of information. That is not the case today. We all choose the kinds of information that we choose, and a lot of people choose sources that are going to confirm their biases about how the world works and what's important. And so that landscape makes it a lot more complicated, and that is part of the challenge here. In addition to those societal contributing factors, I think there are contributing factors in the science society world that are relevant to this conversation. One is that the perceptions that citizens have of scientists is quite interesting to explore and sample. Many people don't trust molecular biologists. They think that they just play God. So that's a problem. If some kind of science is seen as having some kind of ulterior motives. Other kinds of science, and environmental science is often criticized for always being doom and gloom. There's nothing good. It's always bad. It's getting worse and worse and blah, blah, blah. And people just kind of tune out and say, okay, I've had enough of this. I don't want it anymore. I'm not going to listen to you. So those are perceptions that are out there that we need to be aware of. Not that they apply across the board to all of society or to all of science, but there are perceptions of different types of science. Fortunately, social scientists have done a lot to think about and understand the perceptions that people have of science and ways in which scientific communications can be made more effective, ways in which engagement of scientists with society can be more effective. This is just a handful of reports from the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council around this topic, but there's a lot more richness. And I want to pull out a few of the findings that I think are relevant from not just these reports, but from others as well. And I'm going to start with this one. Most Americans cannot name a living scientist. That's stunning. That's incredible. Scientists think, well, of course, all of my friends and colleagues know I'm a scientist, but when asked to name someone, they say, Einstein? And then they think, oh no, he's probably dead. And then, a name, the 30% that could name one person, who do you think that was? Who is the person that most people would come up with? The number one person was Stephen Hawking, which is unfortunate because people can no longer name him, but he did leave his legacy and he was well known. Bill Nye, yes. Neil deGrasse Tyson, yes, are ones that some people will name. Jane Goodall is another. So there's just a few that are out there. So here's an incredible opportunity. We need more scientists being seen as scientists by the public, okay? In addition to that, social scientists have looked at what is it about a scientist or anybody, what is it about someone that makes them be seen as being trustworthy. And this is research by Fisk and Dupree, and they have concluded that in fact there are two axes that are important to understand. One is the axis of warmth. How warm does someone seem to the audience? And the second is an axis of competence. How much do they know what they're talking about? And what these social scientists found was that for somebody to be seen as trustworthy, they had to be both competent and warm. It was not enough for them to be seen as just competent. They had to also be warm to be trustworthy. So you can see here, professors, researchers, scientists in general are seen as being highly competent, but not so much on the warmth side. Scientists are often competent, but cold. So that is something that's in our power to change. And part of that is a communication style. Part of it is the way scientists are trained to talk to people. Don't tell stories, stick to the facts, blah, blah, blah. Start with all the evidence, and then finally, when everybody's sound asleep, get to the point. So a lot of the things that are sort of the way the culture of science has evolved don't help us be seen by the public as trustworthy because we don't not seen as being warm. Now that doesn't mean you cannot be warm and competent, but I think those are some interesting lessons to be learned. There's no doubt about the fact that for some issues, there is a gap between where the scientific community is and where the public is. That's true on topics like evolution, vaccines, climate change. And it's important to just understand that's the lay of the land. It's also useful to know that the public is not all one monolithic uniform thing. This is a figure from some of Tony Lyserowicz's work at the Yale program on climate communication. And what they found was that, in fact, there are a whole series of different publics that are out there. And this is what their analyses show as of March of 2016, that 17% of the American public are alarmed about climate change, 28 are concerned, 27 cautious, 7 disengaged, don't care, not listening, 11% are doubtful, and only 10% are outright dismissive. So understanding that lay of the land is actually really helpful in thinking about how to communicate on topic as challenging as climate change. We've also learned through the years about what kind of ways to communicate work for science. Teeing off Dupree and Fisk's work, being warm, being personal is useful. Telling stories. Social scientists tell us that stories are sticky. People remember them. And that's why all of our elected representatives tell stories. People remember them. They can encapsulate something. So that is a useful communication tool. The 3 thys. Know thyself. So know what you know and what you don't know. And your style. Know thy audience. So every audience is not in the same place. Understand what your audience is, where they're coming from, how much they know, so that when you are connecting with them, you can do so in a way that tees off what they know, fill in what they don't know, listen to ideas they have, incorporate them, etc. But know thy stuff as well. And don't get caught up in being an expert on everything that you aren't. I just can't tell you how many Nobel laureates I know that once they have that imprimatur, think they're an expert on everything and start spouting off on everything. And in fact, they shouldn't be. So, know what you know and what you don't know. One of the biggest challenges I find, and one of the most powerful things to do, is to find good analogies and good metaphors to connect the dots for people between something they know well and something they don't know at all, and it's very confusing. And if you can connect those dots through analogies and metaphor, that can really break through and say, oh, okay, now I get it. Finding common ground with your audience, not just starting with the facts and assertions about what is the answer, but finding common ground and creating a shared value experience enables you to then pursue things that might be particularly contentious. So this is just a quick summary of some of the things that are communication tips that have evolved through time. Another one is to simply simplify your messages. Scientists tend to just blah, 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 lots too much complication. So keep it simple. But also tailor your messages to a specific audience in terms of what they're interested in, what they know, what they care about. And finally, a good tool that a lot of people have discovered is the message box that was developed by and used by Compass, which is, if you're interested in that and don't know about it, you can find it on the Compass website, compassscicom.org. That blue doesn't come through very well, and I couldn't change it because it's one of these URLs, and it's just a default color, so sorry about that. Okay, so against the backdrop of this, there is a new report that is just out from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences about public perceptions of science in America that has a lot of interesting findings. It's easy to assume that science is really in trouble and everything is bad, but in fact, this report, I think, has a lot of reassuring things that enable us to be smarter about how we're talking about these issues. I'm going to highlight just a few findings from their report. Number one, Confidence in scientific leaders has remained relatively stable over this period of time from 1973 to the present. This shows you the percentage of US adults that have a great deal of confidence in the leaders of, let's start with Congress, the press, and banks. So that's purple, yellow, and green. These have all gone down through time. People have lost confidence in that leadership. Military, the blue, kind of teal color, has risen through time. People have more confidence than they used to in military leaders. Science during this time, orange, has remained pretty steady. So that's actually very useful information. It's very powerful. People still, by and large, have confidence in scientific leaders. A majority of Americans view scientific research as beneficial. So this is starting in 1985 through the present, and this is the percentage of people who say that, in the blue, benefits of scientific research outweigh the harm, potential harm. So that's remained pretty constant. That's also really encouraging, and that's pretty high. 70% say the benefits outweigh the potential harm. These are the responses for benefits and are about equal to harm. Harm is greater than benefit, and don't know are those three categories, just in case you can't read them. So taking that into account, the question is, how can we resolve this science society paradox and address the post-truth mentality? And what I just covered was sort of understanding where we are, but what some of the challenges are. I'm going to pivot now to suggesting that to address those, respond to those challenges that are out there, we can't just stay in our ivory towers in academia or halls of federal agencies in Washington, D.C., or wherever you are. We need to be more integrated into society, physically and psychologically integrated. In other words, scientists need to engage more and more effectively with society. Okay, that's all well and good. How do we do that? What does that mean? Well, first and foremost, I would suggest that we need to demonstrate to people the value of science, not just assert. It's not just trust me, but actually show them and demonstrate that it is. This is a lot easier to do with weather forecasting, for example, than some of the other things. But we also need to provide hope. We need to not just have everything focus on all the bad, but actually be a little more balanced, and to understand what are the impediments within the scientific reward, within the cultures of academia, the cultures of agencies, and what is it that we're training our people to do. So let's dig into those a little bit more. Demonstrate, not just assert the value of science. Well, a lot of the challenge here is in the entitlement rhetoric that I often hear from academics or from government people. I'm from the government, I'm here to help kind of thing, but also, trust me, we've done the research on this. And instead of just asserting that something is the way it is, we need to actually demonstrate it. Make science more accessible, show its merits, and engage citizens. And the opportunities to engage citizens is a very, very powerful one. Whether it is citizen science around weather, whether it is fishery cooperative programs to get data on abundance of fish stocks, to do fishery management plans, whatever it is, engaging scientists in that is very, very powerful. In so doing, we can create trust. You can develop shared values and shared experiences that then can be built on that, and show people that, in fact, who scientists are, that they're actually warm, caring people, and then have science be seen as trusted. as opposed to countering the narrative, the assertions that are often out there that science is wasteful, it's imperious, it's threatening, it's doom and gloom, etc. These are not new practices for many of you in this room. This is not something that is totally foreign. This is something that is easier for some types of science than others. But I think it's worth taking stock of, can we do a better job of this, and what are the lessons learned that we can pass on to other communities? The second way that we can do this is to provide hope, and that is simply to identify and share successes that are out there. Let's replicate and scale them. So instead of always sort of asking for more money for this program, talk about the successes and have those successes really be broadly recognized and broadly publicized. Find those successes, replicate them, and scale them. And the opportunity to focus on what is driving a particular behavior, how do we change the incentives so that people can be incentivized to do the right thing is useful. And then creating solutions. And part of this will require teaming up with others, whether it's civil society or businesses that have complementary skills and goals. I think is a real opportunity. Part of the framing for discussions about science harken back to the dichotomy that's in a lot of people's minds between basic research and applied research. And Donald Stokes in 1999, wrote in his book, Pasteur's Quadrant, actually it's 97, I see here, that in fact, that framing doesn't really capture much of the richness of the science that we do. Basic science is research that has low consideration of use, but is high just in the quest for fundamental understanding. How does the world work? Applied science is often seen as high consideration of use, but making very little contribution to the advancements of knowledge. And Donald Stokes says, hey folks, there's actually a third category, which he calls use-inspired science, which is fundamental research that is making advances in fundamental knowledge, but is also immediately relevant to society. And I would suggest that in fact, this is a very rich area for which we need a lot more action, a lot more funding. Not that basic science is unimportant. It's incredibly important because we don't know where the next frontiers are going to be. But we need a lot more, in my view, use-inspired science. One of the projects that I've been involved in has been pushing the boundaries of science in the ocean to better understand how much of the ocean do we need to protect? What kind of protection? How much of the ocean? How big should protected areas be? How compatible are they with other uses? How do we, how far apart should they be? Those kinds of things. So that's just a very quick example of use-inspired science. Providing hope, I was really encouraged and heartened to see the Earth Optimism Summit that was created initially last year by the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, Nancy Knowlton, the Sant Ocean Chair at the Smithsonian Institution, took the lead on this. Over 250 scientists from 24 countries came together to share the good news stories that were very powerful, and most people had never heard of them. You hear about the doom and gloom, but you don't read about the amazing stuff that's going on. They took the next step this year was to have a digital event to do the same thing. And so this is really moving beyond doom and gloom and providing hope for people in the planet focused on oceans. So we've seen two kind of pivots within the scientific community. One in the 90s and the 2000s, from just doing science to a more emphasis on sharing, and more recently from just communication to actual engagement with society, which is a very different thing, and partnerships. Also from just basic science to basic plus use-inspired science, which is called translational science by the biomedical community, so that's the same idea. And also from just diagnosing problems to crafting solutions. So the scientific community is responding to a lot of the new needs that are emerging from society. And I would suggest that this is very encouraging, but that it's not yet at the scale that's needed. We don't have enough people doing these. And I think it's useful to think about another nod to social sciences, Everett Rogers' model that talks about diffusion of innovation, whether innovation is an idea or a new technology, he was saying, what are the steps that it takes for something to be created and then eventually go viral? And he suggests that there is this bell-shaped curve where you have early innovators creating some idea, early adopters sort of taking it up, majority adopters bring it to a point. There are late majority and there are laggards, some of which will never come on board. But the question is, how do you take something and have it actually go viral so that it's self-sustaining? How do you reach the critical mass? And so these early innovators, early adopters is what we see going on in this space now that I've been talking about. How do we actually have these innovations reach critical mass and have a much greater influence on public perceptions of the value, the importance of science, and what it means to them in a very personal sense. So some of the impediments to achieving the things that I'm talking about are the cultures within the academic world, the cultures within government world, and that means partly the reward system, partly the expectations, what are the job descriptions for people. Oftentimes in agencies across the board, scientists are rewarded for being good administrators, not for being good scientists, okay? That's a problem. We need to have good scientists, but we also need them out engaging with the world, not just managing programs. In the academic community, when you come up for promotion and tenure, you are rewarded for grants, publications, and good teaching. You're not rewarded for doing engagement, even though it takes time. So those are cultural challenges that are preventing some of this from happening. Some of the other impediments are the training that can unleash the younger generations who want to be doing more of this engagement, more of the use-inspired science, but aren't quite sure how to do it. And also the infrastructure for partnerships, because partnering with business, partnering with civil society, partnerships between professional scientific societies and government agencies have a whole world of possibilities that we haven't yet tapped. So modifying the reward structures so that we can actually remove those impediments is, I think, a key next step. So we want to have, if we believe engagement is important, we have to have that be part of the expectation for what people will do, and they have to be recognized and rewarded for doing it. Students need to be encouraged, enabled, and trained to engage effectively. And we have to recognize that doing that takes time, and you can't expect people to excel at everything. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't think all scientists should be engaging, for example. Some of them probably shouldn't. But I would assert that they should all support those who do, their colleagues who do. So I've talked about the science society paradox, some of the responses of scientists sort of on the defense, emerging reactions that are going on the offense, and the emerging opportunities I've touched on. And the real opportunities are to do a better job of embedding science in society. We need to infuse a lot more science into social media. We need to enhance the opportunities and effectiveness for citizen science. We need to team up with communities to solve their problems that they have identified, so this is science in service to them. Make science a lot more visible and relevant. And a lot of opportunities now are emerging for scientists to run for office. So these are all more on the offense. And the Political Action Group 314 Action has just recently announced that there are actually 450 scientists that are running for local, state, and federal offices. 25 of them at the federal level. So that's pretty amazing, and is sort of, I think, a reflection of the interest of the scientific community in being part of the solution, not just part of the problem. So this will require new innovations, confronting the cultural barriers that I've talked about, providing new incentives for the actions that I've described, providing the kind of training and mentoring, training not just in communications, but how do you engage effectively? How do you do conflict resolution, negotiations, system thinking, teamwork, are all things that are going to enable scientists to be more effective with this engagement. And then creating the networks and the partnerships and the funding to enable that to happen. Creating a new community of practitioners that are actively in connecting science to the public, to society. And that will entail opportunities to trade best practices and share ideas. So we've seen some innovations from the ivory tower to the social contract, and now I think we're seeing another innovation from social contract to science embedded in and serving society, maybe. So in my view, a strong offense means serving society better, engaging more effectively, co-creating knowledge with citizens, providing hope, focusing on solutions, removing the cultural barriers so that those things can happen, and improving training and engagement. So my message, I'll end with where I started. Science is indeed facing some major challenges. Maybe it's not quite as bad as we might have thought, but we have unparalleled opportunities to serve society better. And this is only going to happen if scientists really take the bull by the horns and step up and make things happen. And I'd like to think that we can do this in a way that is inspired by Jim's example in confronting challenging times and figuring out how to navigate those. And I would suggest that maybe if he were here, he would say, it's time for us to take back the narrative. It's time to write a new chapter in the relationship between science and society, and for us collectively to have a quantum leap in relevance. And the question is, will you join me in doing that? Thank you.
So we have time, about 10 minutes for question, and I thought I'd start off just as you sort of gather your thoughts, because there's one thing I really resonated with your entire talk. I also thought maybe you were just a little short of something that I've always thought was important, in that it is, engagement is key. But I think one of the problems I think we've had as scientists is it tends to be one way. We tend to lecture to people. And I sort of learned with at least community engagement, and some people at universities that have used the term community-based science, it's a two-way conversation that we talk with the people and make sure they feel like they're equal partners, rather than, I suppose the analogy is we've got the hammer, we're going to come up and look for a nail with all the good things we've been doing. So communication is important, but also I think that dialoguing. So that's my question, whether I think you were sort of going in that direction. I didn't quite see that final statement made, but see if that is true or not.
So Roger, you're absolutely correct, and I see that the way a lot of people do communication is really one way. You know, social scientists talk about the deficit model, that a lot of people think, you know, I've got the knowledge, and the person that I'm talking to is this empty vessel. All I need to do is dump in a bunch of knowledge, and they will agree with me and do what I think needs to be done. And that deficit model of communication is fatally flawed, doesn't work. So communication does have to be two-way. But engagement to me is not only two-way, but it is co-creating knowledge. It's listening as much as talking. It's not just saying, I've got the answers. It's what are the problems that we can work on together, and to bring different resources to the table, bring different types of knowledge to the table. It might be science, it might be other kinds of knowledge, and work together in a way that can co-create knowledge, but that doesn't really happen unless you sort of establish a common language, common values, and you have kind of a journey together, and that's what the engagement really means to me. So I think we're on exactly the same wavelength here. There are microphones in both aisles, and please step up, introduce yourself, and let loose. Mary.
Mary Blackham with the weather company IBM. You know, Jane, one of the things on your chart was citizen science, and it's something that I've thought about a lot because I actually think that's really where you get the mingling that I think you're talking about. And, you know, it's not really citizen science, but I've been just fascinated about weather underground and where people buy personal weather stations. And there's now just about 285,000 of them globally that people have kind of said, yes, I want weather in my backyard, and, you know, and it's a very small value proposition. I was wondering if you'd seen something that was more interactive for a model of citizen science that might touch in this atmospheric community that we could think about.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, citizen science, I think, is just rife with opportunities, and you've mentioned some. I think that weather is an easy one for a lot of people, and you know, people are just fascinated by weather, and to be able to start taking data and then share them, and the whole GLOBE program, which provides an opportunity for kids to start doing that. And that kind of leads to some kinds of interactions. You know, if school classrooms in different parts of the world can be sharing information and talking about what they're finding and what it means, that's a kind of interaction. I think you're talking about beyond that, what are the other opportunities? And there are so many different flavors of citizen science program. I work on ocean acidification, among other things, and we have a group of communities along the Oregon coast that are actively putting out some of the very accurate sensors that we now have available in the ocean, and helping to take data. And measuring ocean chemistry is not an easy thing to do. And you have to measure a couple of different things to actually know how to interpret them, and they have to be accurate. And so teaching people to do some of the basic things that they can do, but then interpreting what that means is a wonderful opportunity for community engagement, and to talk about not just what's happening in the ocean and why, but how what's happening on land connects to the ocean, and how the flow of nutrients from the land can affect the local ocean chemistry, ocean acidification, and other parts of ocean chemistry. So I think using citizen science to initiate conversations, not just about what are the patterns, but what do they mean, and what are the options for changing things if it's not what's if people aren't happy with it, is one opportunity for interaction and engagement. I think you're actually asking a richer question for which I don't really know a complete answer, but I think it's worth thinking about. How can we really unleash the power of citizen science and take it to a whole nother level? And as you know, Noaa has partnered with Zooniverse, as have a lot of other entities, and they've thought a lot about citizen science and how to make it work. So that, I think, would be a good follow-up conversation. Louis.
Thank you. Louis Joining, Director of the Weather Service. And I had the pleasure of working actually for you for about 2 months.
We worked together, Louis.
We worked together. One of the thoughts I've had about when you were listing the three aspects that have had trouble getting traction in climate change, evolution, and vaccines, and then you call out the weather as an illustration of making a connection. That there's an inherent weakness within society in terms of the immediacy of the response. You know, that people see weather around them all the time, see the weather forecast, whether it's going to be right or wrong on a daily basis. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that they've gotten interested in it. in such an extent, and of course the internet has made it so much more accessible. I always felt, on the other side of the ledger, looking at the climate side, right from the beginning, that making up, originally it was the prediction out 100 years, that people's first reaction was walking around.
Yeah.
Basically, who cares? But I think there's something fundamentally changing right now, and it's the sea level rise. That people are actually seeing, people have to see the impacts before they actually start internalizing it and then, hopefully start responding to it. I was wondering if you could make a few comments with respect to that. You mentioned acidification. They're seeing that too. I mean, the beautiful oceans are being affected by that. But it's also the rise that they see in the floods that are happening on tidal cycles now. Could you make a few comments with respect to that? And if you think that's changing, perhaps, the receipt of how we message even the climate change.
Yeah, I agree with you, Louis, that sea level rise is something that is increasingly tangible and obvious to more and more people, especially in certain coastal communities. The Southeast Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic are two prime examples of that. And having that evidence is really changing many of the dynamics around discussions, and it's not just property values, it's also saltwater intrusion for drinking water, it's how it affects recreational opportunities, how it affects many of the things that are economically important to those communities. And that provides sort of another opportunity to connect the dots for people. And it's not just something that's happening in the future that's very remote. It's not just about polar bears in the Arctic. It's actually something that's happening in people's backyards. And that's one of the easier ones to draw direct connections with. We know that we're likely to see a lot more of certain types of extreme weather, extreme precipitation events, heat waves, those kinds of things. We are seeing some of those now. And I've really been pleased with how the science of attribution has really become better and better and better. We still have a ways to go, but I think that's very important. But making it real, making it personal, making it connected to people in a way that they can experience it, I think is very important, and that's easier to do with sea level rise than some other topics, for sure. Neil.
So I used to think, perhaps naively, that it would be impossible to lose an argument when you had all the facts on your side. But it seems now with the growing access to internet that anybody with web access or website can create a complete alternate reality and run away with a narrative. And so my question is, do you think that the peer review publication process as we know it traditionally will exist in the future? And if not, how does it change?
Peer review is evolving already, and I think appropriately so. There are some communities of scientists that don't even go through peer review anymore. They just pop something up. They don't have a formal peer review. They pop something up and everybody comments on it. So, that's sort of one end of the spectrum. But it is evolving. It's probably not evolving as fast as some people might like. But in the end, having, and many people asserted, for example, that WikiLeaks was, that the Wiki model was a flawed model, that you couldn't have non-experts improving on the quality of what some expert wrote about something. But Wikipedia is, in fact, I think, a nice example of how you can have peer review in a bottom-up fashion that actually has pretty respectable results. So there are ways, there are new ways to be doing things that are solving old problems. And I think there are a lot more opportunities to explore how to do that. Some of the challenges have to do with some data are easily shared. Not all data are easily shared. They might be proprietary. They might be confidential. They might be confidential for reasons of from government confidential sources. So there is a limit, and one question is, how do you deal with that disparity when you are having a process that is looking at making decisions based on available data? I would assert that there needs to be some role for expert judgment and experts weighing in, understanding that that's not going to be the answer to everything. But there are, in fact, cases where we don't have the data that we might want to have. You can still entrain expert judgment to help move forward on an issue. So it's a pretty broad, diverse landscape, and the National Academy of Sciences has been leading a number of discussions about some of these issues that I think are very useful and productive, that are bringing together not only social scientists and natural scientists, but other experts in other fields. And it's going to be interesting to see where all of that goes. I don't think there's any one solution that fits all. I think we need to take into account a variety of the things that I've already touched on, and probably some others that I haven't thought of. So should we do just two more questions
Yeah,
and then
just two
end?
more and then we'll
Okay,
have to
so we'll
cut.
keep alternating. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Brendan Doyle. I'm a former student and staff member at Jim Mahoney's.
Nice.
I'm just scratching my head here a little bit. The media doesn't have any trust anymore. The science staff on every major newspaper in the country has been cut to smithereens. They're just not staffing up that department anymore. Could you drill down a little more in what you mean by social media? I can't imagine how I would write a tweet for Dr. Mahoney.
It is a challenge to get good science into social media. There's no doubt about that. But I think some people are doing it, and we need to do it more. That doesn't mean it's easy. We've got twice as many characters as it used to be the case for tweets, so and people do threads. But I think the real power, though, is to link a tweet to a longer treatment of a topic. So you can have a tweet that gets somebody's attention and then points them to a link that takes them to an editorial or a blog or something that provides a little more of the richness. So there are ways to tap into Twitter, for example, which is probably the most constrained. Well, maybe Instagram is even more constrained. It's a single image. But there are ways to use that as an entry point and then take people someplace else. And there are scientists that are actively tapping into that. There are a lot of lessons learned about how to do it well, what some of the pitfalls are. We have to pay attention to that. And I wouldn't suggest that that's the only mechanism for effective communication. It's just one more tool in the toolbox. So, yes, sir, you have the final word.
Yes, I'm Nick Dowd. I was also a colleague of Jim Mahoney's. I think I would like to see you broaden your view and include not just individual scientists, but institutions. I'll give you an example. I was at a presentation about 2 weeks ago by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And they're, as you probably know, are very concerned about Chesapeake Bay and what's happening to it. And they have developed a program in which they take the best knowledge we have on sea level rise and where it's going to be on the East Coast. And they have made these models available to city planners up and down the East Coast. And that is real communication, and it's allowing people in Norfolk and Charleston and Miami to figure out what's going to happen to their cities over the next 10, 20, 50 years. and what they have to do. And that's real communication where people live. And that's an institution, not an individual scientist. But I think we need to expand it to include institutions.
Thank you for suggesting that. I completely agree. And not only institutions like Chesapeake Bay that you mentioned, but also professional scientific societies. So we can bring it back to AMS and bring it back to sort of why we are here. And with that, let me just say thank you so much, everybody, for coming and for your great questions. And I look forward to continuing these conversations. Roger?
So much. So by the way, I'll interject just very briefly. At UCLA, I just learned something about a month ago that they have something called a Grand Slam competition, and it's really looking at the next generation. And it's asking graduate students in 3 minutes to be able to present their research at a level that anyone can understand. And they time it, and they do really beautifully. So I think even institutions, universities are responding to this challenge. So again, thank you so much, Jane. I know Barbara wanted to come up and say a few things before we call this whole session to a close.
Well, I'll be very, very brief. I am between you and the reception, but my job is really a very easy one, which is to thank everyone for coming and to thank our esteemed lecturer for a provocative, incisive, thoughtful, and 1,000 other adjectives that there's no time to say. But a few words of context. First of all, it's thrilling for those of us who had an idea, and I say that with my Rhode Island accent, idea, a few years ago when Jim Mahoney passed, that we wanted to establish this lectureship. And we've had 3 outstanding lecturers. And today I've communicated with lecturer number 1 and lecturer number 2, Susan Avery and Richard Moss, who both bring very kind regards to everyone here. So now you have, Dr. Lubchenko, you have now joined this elite small group of lecturers. And I said to someone today that we've started now on the path to perpetuity, because really what we are trying to achieve here is to set up a lectureship that in Jim Mahoney's memory to honor his legacy. My involvement with Jim Mahoney was pre-Noaa. I was a Harvard graduate student. A lot of what you said today on public-private partnerships and a lot on interdisciplinary ways of coming to a bottom line resonated with me. So my work goes back very, very far, but a lot of what he had done earlier in his career had to do with broader environmental policies, and he was very instrumental in those days going to Japan and Russia and Saudi Arabia, very instrumental in setting up the environmental control programs of those countries, and I think his CV would say that there's at least 47 other countries. So the lectureship clearly would not have happened without the tremendous support of AMS and Noaa, and so I applaud both organizations. And really the continuing leadership in both organizations, so very appreciative of that. So I think that they're really, the thing is we've had 3 giants in their field speak to us. We would ask, I think in closing, that people keep in touch. There is, you can do it through AMS. There's, I think you all know, there's an AOL email address on the bottom of your programs. Those of you who are so disposed and want to make contributions to this lectureship, that I'm sure would also be appreciated. And also, we have a list of potential other lecturers, but if people have additional ideas, I'm sure that we'd be happy to have those. So I think that, again, I thank you for an outstanding lecture and for everyone being here, and we look forward to all the lectures in perpetuity. And now, on behalf of the American Meteorological Society, thank you, and please join us at the reception just outside the door. So thank you again.